Order. We now move on to the next debate, media sexism. I call Member Caroline Lucas.
Thank you very much, Mr Hood. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. There are a few things more important than ensuring that every member of our community feels safe in their own home, in their own workplace, community and school. Sadly, for far too many women and girls in the UK, this is simply not the case, and there is strong evidence that media sexism is playing a significant contributory role. I want to start by outlining some of the consequences of the fact that objectifying women has become so normalised in our society, before exploring the extent and nature of media sexism, as well as what action is required. Because the shocking facts are that here in Britain, 60,000 women are raped every year. 2 women a week are killed by a partner or ex-partner. Sexual harassment in our schools, communities and workplaces is routine. In Brighton and Hove, home to my constituency, an estimated 11,000 women experience physical and emotional violence every year, and last year over 2,700 women experienced sexual assault. Now, the city's new strategy for prevention offers valuable insights into the way that violence is normalised.
Order.
Noting
Order.
that.
Can I tell the honourable member there's standards of dress that members must comply with, both in the House and in Westminster Hall, and I would ask the honourable member to respect that and put her jacket on that she had when she came on back on, please.
I will, Mr Hood, of course, comply with your ruling, but it does strike me as a certain irony that in this place you can get copies of The Sun. Perhaps I could even show you what's in The Sun. In
Order,
8 places,
order,
8 places in this House, you can get this magazine.
Order. I am not commenting on what the member may wish to say in the debate. I'm only addressing the appropriate means of addressing. If she does that, then she can carry on with her speech. Caroline Lucas.
Thank you, Mr Hood. I was simply going to say it does strike me as an irony that this T-shirt is regarded as an inappropriate thing to be wearing in this House, whereas apparently it is appropriate for this kind of newspaper to be available to buy in 8 different outlets on the Palace of Westminster estate. And that is why I've written to the Palace asking for them to be withdrawn, not to be on sale until page 3 is removed. Mr Hood, I was describing a violence against women strategy in Brighton and Hove, and quoting from it to say that the city's new strategy for prevention offers real insights, I think, into the way that violence is normalised. And it says that violence against women and girls is a continuum. It's the basic common characteristic that underlies many different events in women and girls' lives, involving many forms of intimate intrusion, coercion, abuse and assault that pass into one another and cannot always be readily distinguished, but that as a continuum, they're used to control women and girls. It goes on, many women and girls learn to discount and minimise forms of violence and abuse, both as a way of coping, but also because it is so normalised. And this isn't just about extreme cases, it's an epidemic with the symptoms identifiable at an early age. A YouGov poll for the End Violence Against Women Coalition found that over 70% of 16 to 18-year-old boys and girls said that they heard sexual name-calling towards girls routinely at school, and even more disturbing, that 1 in 3 girls said they experienced groping or other unwanted sexual touching at school. An NSPCC study reveals that almost half of teenage girls believe that it's acceptable for a boyfriend to be aggressive towards a female partner, whilst 1 in 2 boys and 1 in 3 girls believe that there are some circumstances when it's okay to hit a woman or to force her to have sex. And the point I want to make this morning is that none of this is happening in a vacuum. We have to recognise the impact of wider culture. And today I want to focus on just one aspect of that, the objectification of women in the media. Women have been degraded, belittled and served up as sex objects in some of our daily newspapers for many years, despite the UN Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women repeatedly identifying the links between the portrayal of women as sexual objects with attitudes that underpin violence and discrimination against women and girls. A government-commissioned sexualisation of young people review found there's evidence that suggests a clear link between consumption of sexualised images, a tendency to view women as objects, and the acceptance of aggressive attitudes and behaviour as the norm. And the American Psychological Association report that viewing media which portrays women as sex objects leads people to become significantly more accepting of gender stereotyping, sexual harassment, interpersonal violence and rape myths. The scale of the the sexism that pervades our media was highlighted last year by women's groups, including the End Violence Against Women's Coalition and Object, who gave evidence to the Leveson inquiry and later published a report called Just the Women. This examined how domestic homicide cases are reported as tragic one-off incidents rather than part of a well-understood pattern of behaviour. How rape cases, in some papers, are routinely placed next to pictures of half-naked women. How cases of forced marriage or honour-based violence are explained in terms of culture or religion or almost anything except about violence against women and girls. How news reporting upholds myths about sexual and domestic violence, often implicitly blaming women for violence committed against them or eroticising such violence. How images and stories which sexualise and objectify women are normalised. How women are frequently vilified and infantilised by the media, particularly those in political office. Now, Lord Justice Leveson's response concluded that, and I quote, the evidence as a whole suggested that there is force in the trenchant views expressed by the groups and organisations who testified to the inquiry, that the page 3 tabloid press often failed to show consistent respect for the dignity and equality of women generally, and that there was a tendency to sexualise and demean women. Now, I'm not suggesting that the media is solely to blame, but its objectification of women goes some considerable way towards explaining why prejudicial attitudes to women are so deeply entrenched and so deeply normalised. Now, a few months ago, Mr. Hood, inspired by the brilliant Everyday Sexism and Everyday Media Sexism campaign, I asked constituents to help me gather evidence of the problem. And I've since joined forces with women's groups in Brighton and Hove to launch the Spot the Sexism campaign, a month-long campaign dedicated to sharing experiences of how women are portrayed in the media. I'd like to give you a sense of just a few of the contributions I've received so far. More are coming in, and I hope very much the Minister will agree to a meeting later in the year, as some of my constituents would very much like to have the opportunity to talk about their experiences. But let me start with a Mail Online story about Britney Spears that appeared on March the 8th, ironically International Women's Day, and it opens like this. Like many women, Britney, who has a net worth of nearly $200 million, appears to struggle to find the right bra. On this occasion, Britney's booby trap appears to be caused by a lack of support, and a sure sign that she needs to use some of her earnings to splash out on some correctly sized lingerie. The website used 8 photos of the singer to make its point. On the same day, the website also carried this headline about a Girls Aloud singer, saying, being on tour certainly suits you. Kimberly Walsh shows off her tiny hourglass figure in a clinging white dress. And the story was illustrated with 3 virtually identical photos of her in said dress. Now, the spurious news element in both pieces was presumably that 2 women had bothered to get dressed before leaving the house. But the subtext is that they're worth nothing more than the content of their wardrobes or the shape of their bodies. The frequency with which women's looks are used to undermine them was underscored by a Telegraph piece that irritated another of my constituents. It was about the Conservative candidate for the Eastleigh by-election, in which far more was said about her appearance than her policies. Specifically, the fact that the journalist decided that she must have been airbrushed in the billboard posters because the real-life version of her looked so tired and harassed rather than sleek and happy. Another constituent cites every single story in the Daily Mail's so-called sidebar of shame. And of course, the irony is that that's a part of the content aimed directly at women. Indeed, the Daily Mail comes in for more criticism than most, including for the way it's still struggling with, as one constituent puts it, the right, or is it the wrong, age to have a baby. She's referring to the endless stream of articles critical of women having children later in life, as well as having them too young, or of working mothers, or those who stay at home. The articles also accuse those of being too old for IVF, and the quiz career women who've failed in their so-called duty to produce offspring. Another constituent says this example of media sexism, saying the Sun's leery front page on Reeva Steenkamp a fortnight ago was particularly outrageous. They wouldn't print a picture of a recently murdered man in his swimming trunks, one hopes. A constituent who complained about a BBC trailer for a children's TV programme in which girls are shown answering phones and applying makeup while the boys are shown operating cameras and reading the news got this reply. I can assure you that the trail certainly wasn't designed to perpetuate any negative gender stereotyping. However, I fully recognise your concerns about how girls are shown throughout the trail. To that end, I'd like to assure you that I've registered your concerns on an audience log. The audience logs are seen as important documents that can help shape decisions about future programming and comment. Well, Mr. Hood, the message doesn't really seem to have got through. And I myself was incensed to see even a trailer for BBC Parliament, that august channel that uses clips of exclusively male politicians. There were 12 politicians, all of them male, to depict the cut and thrust of politics. And I wonder what kind of message that's giving out to any young girls or women who might be considering going into politics. And then, of course, Mr. Hood, there's page 3. A symbol of the fact that pictures which are illegal on the workplace walls because of equalities legislation are still allowed to be featured in our newspapers. And sexually objectifying images which would be restricted from broadcast media before the 9 p.m. watershed are printed in national newspapers which are not age-restricted and are displayed at child's eye level. Defenders of page 3 argue that adults should be able to choose to look at images of topless women, and anyone who doesn't like it doesn't need to buy The Sun. Now, as the nation's most popular newspaper, The Sun is seen by around 7.5 million people every day, according to market data. Many have not chosen to view these images, but they can't be avoided, whether in cafes, on the bus, or left lying around the pub. And that means that children in particular are at risk from being exposed to page 3. And here are a few examples of how page 3 helps normalise the objectification of women's bodies and the consequences. A schoolgirl wrote to the Everyday Sexism Project saying that the boys in her school hold up page 3 in the corridor and mark the girls out of 10 as they walk past. A teacher who asked the class to bring in newspapers for art class had to explain why there's a naked woman in the so-called newspaper. A mother who took her 6-year-old daughter to a cafe for a treat and found page 3 lying open on a table was asked, "Mummy, why isn't that lady wearing a top?" And a father felt outraged that a man was looking at page 3 while his 3.5-year-old daughter was having a haircut. Now, none of these people buy The Sun, and none want to look at images of topless women in newspapers, and yet they had little choice. Now, as Lucy Holmes, founder of the wonderful No More Page 3 campaign, says, we are all affected by page 3, whether we buy it or not, because we all live in a society where the most widely read paper in the country makes normal the idea that women are there primarily for men's sexual pleasure. And Mr. Hood, the answer is not to turn over, as the Prime Minister has suggested. To turn the page on inequality, on prejudice, on harassment and violence doesn't make it go away. And nor is the fact that some page 3 models say they feel empowered by men looking at their bodies any justification, because many more women are disempowered by the objectification of their and other women's bodies. Lucy Holmes again says, we see page after page of men doing all of this stuff like running the country and achieving in sport, and then there's an image of a woman standing there in her pants. The impact on young girls' self-image is especially worrying, as has been recognised by Girl Guiding, and they are supporting the No More Page 3 campaign with the message that, and I quote, we need to get used to the idea that women are not for sale. In common with the No More Page 3 campaign, I don't think that women's breasts are acceptable daily content for a family newspaper. And for this and a whole host of associated reasons, I'd like to join them in calling on the paper's editor to consign page 3 to the rubbish bin where it belongs. To date, public pressure has secured the most public sign from the Sun's proprietor that the paper might scrap page 3. But the clock is ticking, and we still haven't seen any concrete action. So if page 3 still hasn't been removed from the Sun by the end of this year, I think we should be asking the government to step in and legislate. And there are other areas where the government could act as well. The National Federation of Retail Newsagents issued updated guidelines on displaying adult or top-shelf titles in December 2012, and the government could, as a small but important step, consider whether to make these guidelines mandatory rather than voluntary, as it is at present. It could also extend them to a wide range of publications to ensure that young women, in particular, are better protected from page 3 type images. Colleagues may know that there are also currently moves to hold supermarkets and newsagents to account under equality legislation for stocking publications that degrade women, and I hope the Minister will look at that as well. Women's groups such as End Violence Against Women Coalition also argue that newspapers and magazines which are not age-restricted should always be suitable for wider audiences, in other words, audiences that include children and young people. That means that all content, including advertising, must be suitable for children to consume if they choose to buy the publication or if they should come across it unawares. The groups recommend that sexual material, such as images of nudity and or language of a song's sexual nature, which isn't justified by the context, is not printed in newspapers or magazines that are not age-restricted. Now, these principles already exist for broadcast media, and I'm interested in what the Minister thinks about introducing some consistency. But crucially, we also need wider media culture to change as well. And we could start by ensuring that the new Editor's Code of Conduct which has been introduced in the wake of the Leveson inquiry, we could start by ensuring that that code of conduct has a much stronger clause on what the definition of discrimination actually is, in line with equalities legislation and designed to protect people from violation, and also in line with the government's international obligations on equality. People with expertise in equality should be an integral and permanent part of drawing up and overseeing implementation of the code as well. Now, that would help deliver a media that better reflects its audience. Half of us are women, and yet there's still a notable absence of women presenters and journalists. 72% of Question Time contributors are men. 84% of reporters and guests on Radio 4's Today show are men. Just 18% of presenters over 50 are women. Evidence that women are battling against media ageism as well as sexism. And it's not just the TV that's the problem. Researchers have found that from July 2012 to June 2012, women read fewer than a third of the articles in the Mail, Telegraph and Guardian, and only 26% of the opinion pages. Only one national newspaper is edited by a woman, and there's only ever been one instance of a woman editing a daily broadsheet newspaper in the UK, and that was 15 years ago, when Rosie Boycott became editor of The Independent for just 3 months between January to April 1998. Now, women are fighting back with some wonderful initiatives such as the Women's Room and Her Say to promote women experts on a range of topics. And yet, in a media culture which degrades women as standard, they're swimming against the tide. We need a media that features women in all their diversity too, rather than one that inadequately reflects women's roles and contributions to society. Yet this too is an uphill struggle when the industry is dominated by men. A Women in Journalism analysis of UK newspaper front pages from 2012 found that not only were over 3/4 of the stories written by men, but men also dominated the news stories themselves. Of all those quoted or mentioned by name in the lead stories, just 16% were women. It also found significant differences in the role that named men and women play in the news stories. For example, 3/4 of so-called experts were men, and just 79% of so-called victims were women. Women are also twice as likely to be quoted in their capacity as celebrities and 10 times as likely to be featured as victims when compared to men. Now, if it's true that a picture's worth 1,000 words, the photos that make the front pages, not just page 3 of our newspapers, tell a great deal about media sexism as well. And Women in Journalism's analysis further underscores how much men dominate the news agenda, and also examines the particular function that women fulfil for newspapers. Because while there are generally strong news-related reasons for the appearance of most images of men on a sample of front pages, the same cannot necessarily be said for women that feature. They cite the Middleton sisters as an example for whom, and I quote, "The wearing of a new hat or a new dress could be enough to prompt a lead front page picture in a way that would be unlikely to be the case were it, for example, Prince William or Prince Harry stepping out in a new tie." An improved code of conduct needs to go hand in hand with ensuring that the proposed new regulatory bodies are fit for purpose. That means that post-Leveson regulatory frameworks need to institute and include a statutory body with proper women's representation on it and full rights for third parties and groups to complain about prejudicial treatment in the media. That is essential if the press are to be held accountable through fair public scrutiny in line with its own press code. In conclusion, Mr. Hood, sexualised and sexist representations of women in the media provide a conducive context in which violence against women and girls flourish. Earlier, I cited the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, and I welcome the fact that the government has this year joined other member states at the UN Commission on the Status of Women in making a formal commitment to act. It has specifically promised, and I quote, to promote balanced and non-stereotypical portrayals of women with a view to eliminating discrimination against and the exploitation of women and girls, and refraining from presenting them as inferior beings and exploiting them as sexual objects and commodities, and instead to present women and girls as creative human beings, key actors and contributors to, and beneficiaries of, the process of development. I think that's a very worthy objective, a very positive objective, and I look forward to hearing from the Minister what practical action the government will be taking to this end to confront media sexism. I should also like to know from him whether or not he agrees with me that it is a sexist anachronism that The Sun is still available so widely across the Palace estate, and whether he will join me in taking action to try to get rid of that. And I hope that the Minister will lend his full support to the measures that I've outlined today.
Order. Minister Ed Vesey.
Well, thank you, Mr. Hood. This is an unusual
I would say refreshing debate, although I think I probably have to choose my language carefully because I'm reluctant to praise the Honourable Lady for her dress sense, but I think she certainly made fantastic impact in the initial stages of this debate, Mr Hood. I note that you reminded all of us of the current code of conduct for dress in the House. But I think she did make an impact, and she's made an impact with a very powerful speech. And again, I noted just in passing the remarks she made about the opening credits for BBC Parliament, which I confess is not a channel that I watch a great deal. But I do know that the BBC does monitor debates like this extremely carefully. This is one of the few debates where the BBC is mentioned where I haven't been texted furiously by somebody from their public affairs department to put points on their behalf. But I would say that I hope that they've noted what she said about the opening credits of BBC Parliament representing 12 members of this House, male members of this House, representing the so-called cut and thrust of Parliament, and that they will note that actually there are many women members of this House as well who make a fantastic contribution to our debates. This is absolutely a crucial and wide-ranging issue that this debate is covering, and it impacts all of us in this country. And I welcome the Honourable Lady's recent campaign and her ability to secure today's debate. So, in responding to her remarks, I will describe what I believe are some of the fundamental principles with regard to the government's approach to media regulation, and as she challenges me to provide a flavour of how the government is addressing the issue of media sexism more generally. First, may I say that media representation of women is rightly of great concern to many, many people. As discussed in this debate, this can include in particular images or texts that are sexually explicit or objectifying, reporting that trivialises violence against women and girls, accumulated imagery that restricts the diversity of representation of women. And the government fully recognises this concern, including the potential this has to negatively impact on women's participation in public life, as well as how it can affect the way women view themselves and how they might be viewed by others. But as well, it is also worth reminding the House, Mr Hood, that the media does play an invaluable role in our cultural and democratic life. We, as a government, are utterly committed to supporting a vibrant and diverse media industry, a press that has a crucial role to play in our society, shining a light in dark places, holding the powerful to account, and supporting vibrant local and regional communities as well. Freedom of expression is a vital part of our society. But as well as maintaining this freedom, we as a government are committed to maintaining a media that commands the respect of the public through high standards and is capable of appropriately protecting the rights of individuals. So while on the one hand we must promote a vibrant and diverse and free media, we must also maintain and protect the rights of ordinary people. The focus of government regulation, therefore, has always been on supporting these standards and protecting individuals who find themselves, often through no fault of their own, the focus of the media. So I will briefly, Mr Hood, talk about the different types of media regulation in this country, including press regulation, broadcasting regulation and advertising regulation. Turning to the issue of press regulation, which the Honourable Lady spent some time on in her speech, it is important to point out, first of all, that newspapers, of course, are already bound by the law of the land. That includes, for example, the Obscene Publications Act, and it includes the Indecent Displays Act of 1989. Guidance for the display of adult material has also been published by the Press Distribution Forum. The majority of newspapers already sign up to the Editor's Code of Practice, which does continue to be enforced by the Press Complaints Commission until new arrangements are in place. And, as the Honourable Lady pointed out, these issues were considered in detail by the Leveson inquiry. Now, while the Leveson report concluded that the Editor's Code of Practice is generally recognised to be sound, its central recommendations were about how this code could be more effectively enforced. Because while the code sets out a range of requirements around the treatment of individuals who become subject to news, it doesn't veer into the regulation of press content. And this is because content regulation is not something that we have applied to the press in this country, and it's a distinction that, on the whole, Leveson was clear should continue. What he recommended was a reformed system of self-regulation, independent appointments and funding, an arbitration service, a fast complaints handling mechanism, the power to demand apologies and levy fines. He urged the press industry to work towards establishing a new independent self-regulator to address these issues, and he suggested that press self-regulation should be independently verified through a process of recognition. But as the Honourable Lady pointed out, Lord Justice Leveson did examine specifically evidence concerning media sexism. He took evidence from organisations such as EVES, the End of Violence Against Women Coalition, Equality Now and Object, and indeed they did jointly publish a landmark report late last year entitled Just the Women. Lord Justice Leveson summarised and quotes that the evidence as a whole suggested that there is force in the trenchant views expressed by the groups and organisations who testified at the inquiry, that the tabloid press often failed to show consistent respect for the dignity and equality of women generally, and that there was a tendency to sexualise and demean women. He concluded, amongst other points, that what is clearly required is that any such regulator has the power to take complaints from representative women's groups. As a consequence, in his 11th recommendation, Lord Justice Leveson recommended that a new self-regulator should enable third-party complaints to help counteract media sexism, as well as, of course, other issues, and provide redress, and to take complaints, for example, from representative women's groups. The government has considered this recommendation, and it is in fact reflected in the cross-party charter that we published in March. But the government did consider it appropriate to apply a threshold to the consideration of group complaints by the regulator. Now, the reason for that was to ensure that the future regulator was not inundated with complaints whose motive was to forward a campaigning agenda of a group or organisation, and to make sure that complaints didn't impact on the freedom of expression of the press to express an opinion. And I think that's a very important principle. So to summarise, the underlying principle of press regulation has always been that provided that something remains within the law, so long as it doesn't inappropriately interfere with the rights of individuals, it is for adults to choose for themselves what they want to read. And therefore the government does not and has no intention of regulating the content of the press itself.
Giving way, but he's talked a lot about how press regulation means that currently the press is bound by the law of the land. I think that the point that I'm making is that the law of the land doesn't go far enough. Or would he not agree that if Rupert Murdoch does not take steps himself to listen to the campaigners who are asking for page 3 to be ditched, that the government should have a role to step in at that point? Because the point is that the existing law isn't enough.
Right, I hear what the Honourable Lady says, and I know that she is campaigning for a change in the law, but as I say, the government's position is that it doesn't interfere in the content, in press content. There are no plans to change the law in this regard. She mentioned a number of other points in her remarks, and while I'm on the subject of press content, I think it's appropriate to address those. First of all, she suggested that I should meet her constituents after her campaign has concluded and the results have been collated. I certainly think that would be an appropriate meeting to have, and I would go further and suggest that other ministers who are involved in these issues also take part in that meeting. She mentioned the issue about the National Federation of Retail Newsagents guidelines. Now, I take an approach where self-regulation can actually often be more effective than legislation because it is more flexible and it can be updated more rapidly. I certainly suggest that with the National Federation of Retail Newsagents, the government looks at how the guidelines are being applied, how effectively they're being applied, and also maintains a dialogue with the National Federation of Newsagents and indeed with the Honourable Lady and other campaigning groups on whether those guidelines are important. And I think it is important as well, in the time remaining, I probably don't have the time to go into detail about broadcast media, although I would say that there is a difference between broadcast regulation and press regulation, in the sense that broadcasting is pushed into the home, whereas print media, as it were, is often a matter of choice in terms of what is brought into the home. So that is why the level of regulation is tighter for broadcasting. I'll take her intervention, although I note I have very little time to conclude.
It's very kind. With the 40 seconds left, I just want to point out that the point about page 3 is that it's not a matter of choice. It is everywhere in people's shops or on the tube or on the buses. And that's why in my last few seconds I want to really invite him again to take action with me, at the very least to get it off the premises here in the House of Commons.
Well, I'm not planning to join her campaign, if she'll forgive me, to keep the sun out of out of the Palace of Westminster. Again, as I say, it is a matter of choice whether people choose to read The Sun or not, and I don't think that would be an appropriate campaign. But I do only have 3 seconds left, so may I congratulate the Honourable Lady on this effective debate.
Order. Order. I suspend the committee until 4 p.m. as the 2:30 debate has been cancelled.
I will, Mr Hood, of course, comply with your ruling, but it does strike me as a certain irony that in this place you can get copies of The Sun. Perhaps I could even show you what's in The Sun. In
order,
8 places.
Order,
in 8 places in this house you can get this magazine.
Order. I am not commenting on what the member may wish to say in the debate. I'm only addressing the appropriate means of addressing. If she does that, then she can carry on with her speech. Caroline Lucas.
Thank you, Mr Hood. I was simply going to say it does strike me as an irony that this T-shirt is regarded as an inappropriate thing to be wearing in this House, whereas apparently it is appropriate for this kind of newspaper to be available to buy in 8 different outlets on the Palace of Westminster estate. And that is why I've written to the Palace asking for them to be withdrawn not a year. 2 women a week are killed by a partner or ex-partner. Sexual harassment in our schools, communities and workplaces is routine. In Brighton and Hove, home to my constituency, an estimated 11,000 women experience physical and emotional violence every year, and last year over 2,700 women experienced sexual assault. Now, the city's new strategy for prevention offers valuable insights into the way that violence is normalised.
Order.
Noting
Order.
that.
Can I tell the honourable member there's standards of dress that members must comply with, both in the House and in Westminster Hall, and I would ask the honourable member to respect that and put her jacket on that she had when she came on back on, please.
Not to be on sale until page 3 is removed. Mr Hood, I was describing a violence against women strategy in Brighton and Hove, and quoting from it to say that the city's new strategy for prevention offers real insights, I think, into the way that violence is normalised. And it says that violence against women and girls is a continuum. It's the basic common characteristic that underlies many different events in women and girls' lives, involving many forms of intimate intrusion, coercion, abuse and assault that pass into one another and cannot always be readily distinguished, but that as a continuum, they're used to control women and girls. It goes on, many women and girls learn to discount and minimise forms of violence and abuse, both as a way of coping, but also because it is so normalised. And this isn't just about extreme cases, it's an epidemic with the symptoms identifiable at an early age. A YouGov poll for the End Violence Against Women Coalition found that over 70% of 16 to 18-year-old boys and girls said that they heard sexual name-calling towards girls routinely at school, and even more disturbing, that 1 in 3 girls said they experienced groping or other unwanted sexual touching at school. An NSPCC study reveals that almost half of teenage girls believe that it's acceptable for a boyfriend to be aggressive towards a female partner, whilst 1 in 2 boys and 1 in 3 girls believe that there are some circumstances when it's okay to hit a woman or to force her to have sex. And the point I want to make this morning is that none of this is happening in a vacuum. We have to recognise the impact of wider culture, and today I want to focus on just one aspect of that, the objectification of women in the media. Women have been...
Order. We now move on to the next debate, media sexism. I call member Caroline Lucas.
Thank you very much, Mr Hood. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. There are a few things more important than ensuring that every member of our community feels safe in their own home, in their own workplace, community and school. Sadly, for far too many women and girls in the UK, this is simply not the case, and there is strong evidence that media sexism is playing a significant contributory role. I want to start by outlining some of the consequences of the fact that objectifying women has become so normalised in our society, before exploring the extent and nature of media sexism, as well as what action is required. Because the shocking facts are that here in Britain, 60,000 women are raped every